Thank you all for joining me this afternoon to speak about the Royal Commission anniversary. We have some questions that we'd like to ask you about the healing and support needs of the survivors that you work with. The first question is, can you tell us about the important work that People with Disability Australia do to support survivors of childhood sexual abuse living with disabilities?
Well, I might start with that one. So we work with people who do have a disability, but that can be any form of disability. So that also includes psychosocial disability or mental health and a whole variety of different sensory and neurological and physical disabilities. So we have a pretty broad range of people that we work with. Our team is a redress support team. So we assist people with disability to learn more about the National Redress Scheme and see if that's something that they might be interested in. We help them to understand what it's all about and what the process might be like for them. We also help them to explore other options. Obviously, in conjunction with Knowmore, we can look at things like civil or other options that might be available to them. And then we support them whichever direction they decide to go, whether that be to go through the redress process and put in an application or look into, some civil action. We are a bit different to some of the other support services because we are not a counselling service, although, Dianne is a qualified counsellor. So we don't generally provide counselling, but we connect people with counselling services if that's what they need. And we can give them all the sort of support through, deciding if the scheme's right for them, helping them to fill out the application form, helping them to interact with the scheme, making sure that if they get an offer that they understand, what the offer means, whether they're happy with it, whether they want to accept or decline. And we also assist them to engage, in the DPR process. So that's pretty much what we do.
We do a lot of engagement in different communities as well, which is really important for people with disability because people with disability are everywhere and they're not always seen. Okay, so a lot of people don't realise that people have disabilities or just assume that they don't because not every disability is like, a something that can be seen. All right, so there's lots of mental health and those sorts of things. So we do a lot of support around people with mental health as well, who may be at risk of suicide because of their, the result of the impact of what happened to them. We also provide a lot of accessible material to people and make sure that they have the supports in place that are going to enable them to move forward, and be able to make an application because not everyone can make an application straight away. So sometimes there are other things that we need to do. And as Karen said, it's very different because we work specifically with people with disability. There are a lot of redress services out there that, that provide other particular services, but not one like we provide. So we provide all those additional things as well. And, I think it is really important work, mainly because people with disability come with all sorts of additional needs. And I know I just touched on that a minute ago, but I just can't really stress it enough. And I think sometimes when there's royal commissions, they look specifically into what's happened to people in the past, but not what's going to happen to them like now when they're going through this sort of stuff, when they're going through redress, but also when they've finished redress. What happens then? Who supports them then? How is that going to go? So I know that as part of the redress scheme, they provide ongoing counselling and so on and so forth. But it doesn't always just stop there. People with disability need other supports as well. And often, we find more often than not that it's really hard to get those supports in place to continue on for them.
question 2, how important is it for survivors to have access to services like yours?
We think it's very important because for survivors to participate in any form of redress, and particularly the National Redress Scheme, means that they do have to revisit what happened to them as children. A lot of these people have not spoken of it before, and there is that big possibility of re-traumatization just through going through the process. So redress support services in general are needed because they can support people and help them to access the support they need. The process itself is really lengthy and quite complex. So, I mean, even for a person without disability, there's a lot of forms that need, well, there are forms that needed to be filled in that are long forms and ask for a lot of information. That can be daunting enough for anybody, let alone a person with disability who might really struggle with something like that. So it is very important for people to be able to access services that can assist them with things like that. And there's plenty of other ways, I'm sure, that Linda and Dianne can talk about how we need, why it's important for people to be able to access these sorts of services.
One of the really important things that I think for services like us, support services for to assist people applying for the NRS, is that we understand the language that the NRS want at their end. So whereas an applicant might write things fairly basically, like that person raped me, but we know the NRS wants that spelt out in exactly what that rape looked like. And of course, we know adding that the detail to which they do want it makes all the difference when it comes to the end and receiving a financial component to their application.
Yeah, I think Dianne's touched on that, a really important point there, that the scheme asks people to fill out forms, but some of it is just tell us about your experience, so they're not specific about what information is required. But as Dianne said, we know that the scheme requires some very specific information to be able to determine, you know, rates of payment and whether there's an offer made or not. So that's sort of our job, that we understand that, and we can then get the information that's needed from the people who are applying to give them the best possible outcome with the scheme.
I think also a lot of people can't fill out a form, you know, so they need somebody to help them with that. And you know, it's also really handy to have a service available to somebody who is experiencing mental health challenges, because we can keep a check on how they're going when they're talking about their abuse. So, you know, because this is really tough stuff, and to do that on your own, because a lot of these people have never told anybody in their life, and then they're filling out a form to talk about what happened to them, and they've got no support around them for that. So having supports like ours in place, you know, we ask the questions: are you okay? Do you need a break? We can come back to this. We don't have to do it all now. You know, is there anything that you need? Do you know, and particularly right at the start, we ask them, you know, do you need any counselling? Do you need any other support services? Do you need a support person with you? Because, you know, if somebody's just filling out a form online, they might not even realise that, you know, I might need a support person to help me with this, because I don't know how I'm going to cope when I get halfway through. So, you know, it's really important that, particularly at the beginning of working with somebody, you have those discussions with them and make sure that they're ready to do that application. Because sometimes they think they are and they start it, and then they go, this is a little bit too much. I didn't realise it was going to be this big. the other component is, you know, I found with a lot of the applications that I do where there's multiple people involved and multiple institutions involved, there's multiple forms. There's not one form. We don't just do one form here. So every time there's a different institution, you're doing another component on another form for that institution. And then if there's like 4 people in each institution, you're doing a different form on every person for each institution. And before you know it, that can be like 10 different forms right in front of you. And not everybody is capable of not just being able to fill out the form, but to cope with that. That's a lot. Yeah, and obviously when there is that many applications, like that many institutions and people involved, their trauma history is significant, you know, and they need support to get through that. So just got to chime in on that one.
Something that we've also learned working with people through the National Redress Scheme, that it's incredibly difficult for many people to relive those experiences of childhood abuse, and it's so invaluable to have supports around them through that process, and particularly people that understand what is needed and what parts of their lives that they do need to reopen, and what parts that they might not need to for that process.
I think also, Melanie, it's about, you know, we're trained in this. People tell us about their abuse. We're not shocked, all right? And we can say to them, you know, it's okay, you can keep going. But they might, if they were doing it on their own, they might think, oh, I want Jimmy to be my support person because he's my mate, right? And then they start talking about this stuff in front of Jimmy, and Jimmy's like, holy crap, that happened, really? You know what I mean? Like, before they know it, there might not be the most appropriate support person to have there, or, you know, somebody needs to gauge that and make sure that they're okay, and that shock value isn't like throwing them off and hampering their efforts to fill out the form, if that makes sense.
Does the Royal Commission really emphasise the importance of supports that were delivered by people who had experience working with survivors and experience working with childhood trauma as well, and that's what your service does so well. What are the biggest unmet healing and support needs of survivors living with disability?
That's a like, how much time do you have question? And everyone will want to chime in on this one. We will just say that our team primarily works in New South Wales, although we do information and referral for nationally, and sometimes we work remotely with people in other states. But the biggest issue currently in New South Wales is the provision of psychological support services, which is provided through victim services for the New South Wales government for the scheme. And unfortunately, there is a real lack of qualified and available and experienced professionals to take up that work across the state. It's particularly bad in regional and remote areas. There's just not people out there who can do this psychological support work. Even in, you know, highly populated areas, even in Sydney, there's a shortage. This is something that we have been raising at a higher level, and we're hoping to see some changes made, because one of the very important things, obviously, going through this process and afterwards, because, you know, the psychological support is offered not just during the process, but afterwards if needed, is the actual availability of enough qualified and experienced professionals to do this work. There's a real shortfall in New South Wales at the moment. So that is a really big need. Obviously, another one too is culturally appropriate support, and Dianne might like to talk about that one.
Yeah, so not only is there a total lack of counsellors and psychologists, there's an extreme lack of Aboriginal counsellors and psychologists. Like we're talking the smallest amount. And it is really important for Aboriginal people. I'm an Aboriginal person myself, and it is, you know, swings and merry-go-rounds. Everybody chooses what they want to, who they would like to speak to on a professional level. But in my experience, most of the time us fellas want to talk to an Aboriginal person because it's a language thing, it's a jargon thing, it's a cultural thing, it's a not having to explain what you mean when you use certain words. It's an understanding that your need for country and cultural systems like that, if you need to sit in the bush and talk to someone, then you need that person to understand that that's what you need to do, because that's where you're going to feel safe. Well, you know, it's that's in a nutshell, in a tiny synopsis, that's what cultural support is all about, you know, being able to adapt to that. And I know there's just Aboriginal counsellors are so thin on the ground, it's not funny.
But we also recognise that, you know, counselling and psychologists is a very white model of dealing with things. So there's potentially, you know, other ways of cultural healing that would not actually even involve a psychologist or a counsellor, which are not part of the scheme whatsoever. And I mean, there's other things too, and I have we haven't had any of our clients request them, but I've certainly heard from other services that some clients would prefer alternative things. There's a whole range of different alternative therapies, from, you know, music therapy to art therapy to equine therapy to, there's lots and lots of different things which people might find valuable and useful, which are completely outside of the scope of what's provided through the National Redress Scheme.
And that's it. If you're looking at, you have the potential to have X amount of visits with a professional counsellor, psychologist, whatever that may be, and for an Aboriginal person looking at culturally going, well, look, I just really need to go back. I need to go back home for a minute and just sit on the ground. And it's like, well, I'm not going to use that service because it's too westernised for me. But if I could use that money to go and sit on country for a bit, that'd be, you know, enormous. But, you know, that's like pie in the sky stuff.
Yeah, we've been advocating for some greater flexibility in the system so that people's different healing needs can be met, and particularly for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients where they have different cultural healing needs, for those to be respected and met. Linda?
Yeah, look, I also want to add that this is a national scheme, national redress, right? But it's run through the states. Now, I do a lot of border towns, and you know, when we're talking about supporting people culturally, supporting people at all, sometimes I can't get those supports in place for people. If I'm working with somebody who's living in New South Wales and has been abused in Victoria, I can't get those supports in place for them, because the Victorian government need to provide those supports, and they have a different idea of how those supports are going to be provided to what New South Wales does. So it's completely different. And so my clients can't access New South Wales counsellors because the abuse happened in another state. And it's actually, given that it's a national scheme, it's quite ridiculous that it's run by the states that way. And I'm sorry that I'm speaking bluntly, but it just infuriates me because I've dealt with it a number of times now, and my clients are being affected because of it. They are not receiving supports at all because the states don't come to the party. Like, they don't play nice together at all. And it's the people that suffer because of it.
So
Well,
I'm
we-
glad. Sorry.
well,
go
it's-
on.
Well, we're talking about unmet needs too, and I'm going in a slightly different direction, but can we talk about accessibility?
Yeah. Yeah, let's do that.
So for people with disability, the scheme is not for a lot of people. And look, when we talk about people with disability here, you've got to realise there's a huge range of people with different types of different disabilities, and they all have different experiences of disability, and they all have different levels of being able to cope with things and being able to work within, you know, the boundaries and barriers that society
Sign a
puts up
document.
for them. Yes, so we there's quite a few examples we can give you where the scheme is not accessible. They do listen when we provide feedback, but a lot of this stuff we feel should have been thought of before rather than waiting until it suddenly pops up. Linda's talking about one about signing a document, which I'll let her tell you about, but also, you know, I have a client who is deaf. So the scheme, the best way to meet with her is via a Zoom meeting with an Auslan interpreter where we can all see each other. That works really well. She's very happy with that. But for things like her outcome phone call, the scheme won't do Zoom. It has to be done via a phone where there is a national relay. So, you know, the client has said that it would be much more comfortable and felt much better for them if they could have had a Zoom meeting rather than having it done over the phone. So things like that. Yeah, the thing about people not being able to sign forms, Linda, if you want to talk about that.
Oh. Look, I have a client who's perfectly capable of telling his story, but because of his physical disability, can't sign a form. So then they're like, well, you know, maybe you can submit it via MyGov. No, it's actually not acceptable because he has power of attorney that will read that. Now, this power of attorney does not have financial guardianship. Okay, so power of attorney is a family member who does not know about the sexual assault, and my client does not want them to know about the sexual assault because he's only just regained a relationship with this family member and doesn't want the family member feeling guilty because he was in an institution at the time that it happened. Right? So he doesn't want the family member to know about it. He just wants to submit, and if it's done via MyGov, his family member will read it and see it. And he doesn't want that. So we've asked for other options, but none are forthcoming. We even received an email today that just restated the issues, but didn't actually provide us with a response that's suitable for my client to actually submit his document. So yes, they've listened, but they've done nothing about it.
The other big one too is capacity and consent. So this is a really difficult area a lot of times for people with disability, particularly when an external person is sort of assessing whether they have capacity. So legal capacity it can be quite a different thing. We have, as an example, we had a family of siblings come to us who'd all experienced abuse with differing disabilities. One of the siblings had quite severe disability, and we asked the other siblings, well, if we spoke to them, would they understand what we were talking about? Would they be able to give consent to go ahead with the redress application? And they said no. They wouldn't understand what you're talking about, yet we know that they were sexually abused. Now that we did ask about that one, and we haven't really got very far with that.
The sexual abuse was witnessed by siblings, so we know it happened.
But we also know that the scheme won't let someone put in an application on behalf of somebody else. we would have kept working on that one, but they decided to go away and think about it and haven't at this point of time come back to us. But that's a really big one.
And I think the other issue for that was because given the responses that we had, that we were required to give them, it could have potentially further traumatized the entire family.
Yeah. And so as far as we know at this point in time, none of them have applied for redress, and they may or may not come back and go through with that. So there are a lot of, and this is around accessibility. And also, I've spoken at the joint committee, the parliamentary committee on redress, and I've had one of the MPs ask me, well, what about where there's institutions where there are people with disability and it's known that there was sexual abuse there? Is anyone following up on that? Is anyone going to those people and trying to follow up? And I said, look, as far as I know, that's not being done. I said, in some cases, we have tried to do that because we were quite aware of, there was a whole lot of deinstitutionalisation done, and the responsibility for those people was handed over to certain NGOs. We know who those NGOs are, and we've tried to speak to them about this, but a lot of them didn't want to talk to us about it. And so the problem is, of course, if you've got people who are quite seriously disabled and have cognitive and communication issues, they're likely never going to know about this redress scheme.
Yeah. And they're the most vulnerable and more likely to have been sexually assaulted in a vulnerable situation.
Yes, so we'd love to think we could get the word out to them, but we are a team of 3 people. There are only, to my knowledge now, 2 specific disability organisations who are redress support services. So it's a really big issue. And we would love to get some more help from, the government to actually access people who particularly, and I mean, a lot of these people now live in group homes, now that there are no institutions, but there's still a lot of gatekeeping by the organisations that run them, and it's very difficult to get in. So to me, that's an unmet need, in that these people just may never even know that the scheme exists, or even if they could be told, they may not understand what it's all about. And as it stands at the moment, if they can't understand and give consent, then they can't, an application can't be made for them.
That brings us to, what changes would you like to see to meet to the scheme, but also to meet the healing and support needs of the people that you're working with?
Well, it's very much related to the things that we've said. We would like to, and I can't speak for all states, but I do feel that, when we're talking about psychological support, we think that needs to be improved. Some of the states don't do it the way New South Wales do, and they have a lump sum that's given to people. From what we can tell, that's quite a paltry amount and wouldn't really cover a lot, maybe a year's worth, if they're lucky, of support. The thing that we understand, and as I said, we're not psychiatrists or psychologists, but we have done a lot of professional development in the area, and the thing that we understand is that people, and we know from our experience with clients, people with complex PTSD need intensive long-term psychological support. Ongoing. It's long-term. When we've talked to psychologists and people that work with our clients, and that's what they say. These people are not 12 1-hour sessions with a counsellor. It's like a drop in the ocean. So we'd really like to, and the problem is in New South Wales, technically they should be able to get that long-term support, but not if there's not enough qualified people to provide that. So that's a really big one for New South Wales, and I also feel for the other states, particularly where they have a lump sum, that's not going to provide them with the long-term support that they may potentially need. So that's the psychological support is a really big area that could be improved.
I think just in addition to that, given that it is a national scheme, there should be equal rights for everybody in Australia. Currently, it's not, right? New South Wales does pretty good. We're pretty happy with what is on offer, but the fact of it is, it's on offer, but it's not available. As Karen said, people need ongoing, long-term psychological care, and a lot of the victim services counsellors don't get paid enough to provide that, and they don't want to provide it. They'll provide a few short sessions for them and tick their little box that, hey, I've done my victim services, and then they're out the door. But they don't provide that ongoing trauma-informed, trauma counselling that goes, for a long period of time. When you've got a person with a disability who has, say, for example, autism or complex mental health challenges, you can't fix that in 12 sessions. You can't fix that in 20 sometimes. That's, this is a person that's been sexually assaulted as a child, has this trauma that has catapulted throughout their lifetime to where they are now and just exploded in their head. You can't just fix that and go, there you go, off you go. But that's kind of the way it is. But once again, it's the state thing as well. It's the whole situation of it is unfair. It is really unfair, and it is not providing equal rights to everybody. And as Dianne touched on before, for Aboriginal people, the equal rights here is just that it's not equal. They are not getting the supports that they need, and even we work with a lot of other people from a lot of other cultural backgrounds as well, and counselling isn't something that they do in their countries. They don't understand counselling. They want other supports. They want community supports. They need other types of mentoring and so on and so forth. None of that stuff is available. None of it. So culturally, on a whole range of levels, it doesn't meet the needs. So in order to change that, the scheme needs to put their hand in their pocket. They need to make some changes. They need to make some policy changes as well. They need to make some really strong policy changes about, how provisions of services can be put into place to meet varying needs, not just counselling needs. So that's
one of the other things there too is continuity of service, and I won't talk about it a lot because it's the way the scheme's funded. It's the way redress support services are funded. So we get 2-year blocks of funding. We do know of some services who've had funding and then had it not be granted again. So 2 years, it can often take longer than that for someone to get through their process, considering at the moment applications seem to be taking around 18 months to be processed. Plus, sometimes, it's not unusual for us to have a client. It might take 12 months before we even get to the point of making an application. And particularly when we're coming towards the end of our funding period and we don't know whether we're going to be refunded, it's really hard to say to give people that reassurance that we're going to be with you the whole way through this process, which is what people want. But as services, and we won't be the only one to say this, we can't give them any guarantees that we're going to be able to stay with them right through the whole process because of the way the funding's doled out. And I won't go on and on about that, but it is certainly something that perhaps the scheme needs to consider.
Absolutely. I think what we learnt from the Royal Commission was that survivors often need ongoing counselling and other support throughout their lives, and sometimes they might go in and out of those services as well, and the system really needs to be adapting to those needs. And there needs to be, as you say, better funding, not just for ongoing services, but also better remuneration for the people providing them, and better guarantees for how long those services are available for as well. So,
Yeah, because I had one psychologist tell me specifically they only take on a certain amount of victim services clients because it is such a long thing that you're signing up for. And it's like, well, I earn this much in private practice, but I only get paid this much for victim services. And, you know, everyone's got to put a roof over their head and food on the table. So why would you block up your, you know?
I had the same thing in New South Wales about people who are really qualified to do this work not doing it because the gap is just too big from
Yeah.
in terms of the payment they receive from the government.
Yes.
I think funding should be readily available. So when you're talking about what changes are needed, right, one of the changes that's needed is, you know, funding to be made available for people to access the type of service that they require. Right? Don't just put everybody in a one box fits all and they'll all go to counselling for victim services. They need to be able to access the service that they will require that will help them to work on anything in relation to their childhood sexual assault. Yeah, that's, yeah.
Yeah, like why isn't it? I asked before, sorry, I'm just going to jump in with this one. In another lifetime that I worked for, was asked why weren't my clients, and they were all specifically Aboriginal people, accessing the counselling element of the payment. And I said, because I don't want to talk to anyone else. They want to talk to me. Why do you want to talk to a new person? I want to talk to Dianne because she knows my whole story. She's the one that's helped me all along. I understand her counselling, blah, 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 or, you know, and why can't that be looked at? You know, check my qualifications, check my this, check my that, and then go, okay, well, you can see that person and we can pay that person. Counselling's so personal.
I think one of the things that we find too, talking about continuity of service, and I have mentioned that often it takes a long time. So this can happen with anybody, but particularly with people with disability, because of their disability, it can be a long time before, as I said, we even get the application done. That can take quite a long time. But also this intersectionality. So they may have psychosocial disability, they may be an Aboriginal person, they may have physical disability on top. So there's often the clients we have are if you want to term it that way, a really complex presentation. It's a lot of different things going on. And I know a lot of other services do this, don't want to launch straight into that, well, tell us about your abuse, when they're not in a great place because they've got a lot of other problems. And it can be homelessness, it can be insecure housing, it can be domestic violence, it can be, if you're a person with disability, lack of support, not on the DIS or the DSP. It can be, you know, controlling family members who, you know, are not letting you do what you want to do. There's a whole lot of things. So when we say this continuity of service, when we've got 2 years and we're supposed to sort all that out, get their application in, wait the 18 months for the service, the scheme to get back to us, make sure that they understand their offer, help them to access the DSP. As you can see, that can take years of work, yet we can't guarantee we're going to be able to walk through that with them because we have 2 years of funding. One of the good things, though, I guess, about being part of a disability advocacy service, with some of those other issues that people with disability are experiencing, we do have some capacity within our team, and Linda's an excellent general advocate, but we all have some sort of capacity to assist with some of those other issues. If they're substantial or if they're out of our area of expertise, we can then refer to our other general advocates within our organisation. So we then can work with a general advocate to ensure that some of these issues get some traction before, and we wait. You know, we say to people, look, this might not be the best time for you to do redress, and often they do. They come to us, they say, we want to do redress, but there's so much other stuff going on that they can't possibly talk about redress. So we can sort of say, well, redress can wait. Let's see what we can do to help you with some of the other things that are going on. And I mean, we work specifically with people with disability, obviously, but I know that the other services do similar things. So it's try, and I mean, that's what, honestly, that's what the government requires of us, that we're giving some sort of holistic wraparound service to these people, not saying, well, I can help you fill in a form, but that's all I can help you do. So again, you know, it'd be nice to have that sort of confidence that no matter how long the process takes, we would be there for the clients. And I think that would be, you know, it's trauma-informed practice. People don't like the idea that they're going to have to change to somebody new that they don't know and start all over from someone who doesn't understand them, who hasn't heard their story, and sort of start all over again. That's really, you know, daunting and upsetting and traumatizing for some people.
And it's like that hierarchy of needs, right? Let's just have a look at where we are at as a society right now. All right, people are finding themselves more and more homeless. People can't afford the cost of living. The welfare system or the welfare payments do not keep up with the cost of living. People are living below the poverty line. People are going hungry. People can't even dress themselves because they can't afford to even buy stuff from the op shop, because the majority of their money is going on rent. That's if they're lucky enough to actually have a place to live. So we work with a lot of people like that who, sometimes we even work with people who, because of their mental health challenges, they're at risk of losing where they're about to live. They're not ready to talk about what's happened to them. They need that stuff worked out before they can move forward and talk about redress. And we do a lot of that stuff. We see it all the time. In fact, I would even go so far to say that the majority of my clients, I've had to do some advocacy work for them before I could start. You know, I've been working with a client at the moment. I've started on the application today, and I've been working with this person now for about 8 months. Is it, Dianne? So Karen, about 8 months. I've been working with them for 8 months before they can start their application today. So, you know, and that was a whole load of stuff. And they also don't take into consideration the work that we do when we try to provide choice. Okay, so and Karen touched on this slightly before. We tell people, you know, this is the redress and this is civil. You have some choice, and we refer to Knowmore. Then Knowmore does a consultation with them. Then more often than not, Knowmore will say, well, you need to speak to a lawyer to find out your choices, and then we support them through that process. And then they have more decisions to make as to whether they're going to go down the redress path or whether they're going to go down civil path. And then they need support around that as well, because they often don't know what to do. They often speak to these lawyers that have no idea how to talk to somebody with a disability, and they don't understand what they're saying to them. So we have to be the go-between for that, and that can take a lot of time. And then, you know, if they decide that they're going to go civil, we'll support them through that as well, because we can't just dump them with it and go, okay, well, you deal with that lawyer now. We're not helping you anymore. But none of that reaches the funding bodies. You know, I'm supporting several people through civil now, but I'm not funded to do that. But I can't leave them alone because they don't have the capacity to be able to do that themselves. So it's like,
it's one of the things that DSS doesn't capture either in all their data. They don't ask us how many clients choose to go, or they might ask how many choose to go civil now, but they certainly weren't before, and they weren't asking if we were continuing to support them through a civil case, which we do. Yeah, but back to what Linda was saying too about, you know, unmet needs. And what Linda has said is very, very true. A lot of the people who come to us for redress they're homeless, they're in insecure housing, they can't afford to pay their bills, they can't, you know,
have NDIS issues.
They're choosing between, you know, medication or support and food and all that sort of stuff. And I know that's outside the scope of the National Redress Scheme, but it's not outside the scope of the federal government to actually do something about some of this stuff. I'm sorry, that's all I'm going to say about that one.
I think it's a really important point that often we work with survivors who have such complex needs across different areas of their life, and that can be a direct result of the childhood abuse that they experienced and the trauma that they experienced that then has continued to impact their relationships and their work and other areas of their life.
Yeah, definitely.
What type of support needs are often requested by the people that you're working with, and are those needs being met?
No. More often than not, a lot of our clients require case management, some form of case management. As advocates, we're not here to case manage, but particularly if they've got complex mental health challenges, they require somebody to help them work out. They need to go to this appointment, they need to do this, they need to do that, they need guidance. But that is not readily available at all, like at all. The government doesn't fund case management for people with disability at all. I know there are support coordinators, but they can't provide case management. But they can only provide the coordination of the supports that are in place, because they actually have KPIs that they have to meet, and you know they have hours that they have to meet, and they can't do that complex stuff at all. There are mental health services. More often than not, if a person doesn't have an NDIS plan, there are services there that they can't actually access. So it's kind of, do you know what I mean? There's lots of stuff going on there. But other supports, look, don't get me started about rural and remote communities, because we'll be here the rest of the day, all right? The supports are just not available. They're not there. They're just like, you know, it's not helpful at all. A lot of people don't know about the scheme. A lot of the services don't know about the scheme. And when they do know about the scheme, there's nobody there to support them to access the scheme. So it's, yeah, like I said, we can be here all day on that one. But I've just come back from a town, quite a large town. I only came back on Friday. And I can tell you that I attended, how many services was it, Karen? Did I say 17 in one and about 9 in the other?
Yep.
None of them knew about the scheme. None of them, not one. These are all mental health services, like state-funded health services, disability services, Aboriginal services, community health centres, community centres, you name it, I went there. And none of them knew anything about the scheme. Now, if these services don't know anything about the scheme, how are the community supposed to know? People aren't going to know. They just don't know. And the fact that none of these services know about the scheme, you can bet your bottom dollar that nobody knows how to assist with an application, and nor are they funded to do so, and nor do they actually want to do so, because that's additional work for them, and they're already overworked because they're already underfunded and undersupplied. So, Melanie, a lot of the supports go back to some of the stuff that Karen touched on before, you know. When you're in a rural and remote community, it's really hard to access disability services It's really hard to access, you know, things like getting somebody to fill out a form for you, right? There's no case management, no anything like that anywhere to be found. It's really difficult to access face-to-face counselling services if that's what they want. It's really hard to access any other form of, you know, culturally appropriate therapies. It's just not available. And if it is available, it's not funded. So they can't afford to provide the services to people that are coming over from the scheme, unless they're already a current client, which often they are not. So, yeah.
Huge unmet need.
Oh, there is. A lot of that relates to the whole privatisation of services.
Competition.
Just very briefly, you know, we were sold for a long time as the general public that privatisation will be great. There'll be lots of competition. There'll be, you know, heaps of services. Everything will be cheap and abundant. And it's quite obvious now that that is not the case. So with disability support services and a lot of health services in these rural areas, anywhere outside basically your capital cities, particularly with disability services, that's what called a thin market. So, you know, if you go to a regional town, there might be half a dozen people there with disabilities, and they might all have different needs, but it's not profitable for a private company to maintain a presence in that area because there's not enough volume for it to be profitable for them. And I mean, that's been seen since the NDIS came in and services were privatised, and there's no more, the government no longer acts as a funder of last resort or a provider of last resort for disability support. And, you know, I think this is not just the case with you know, your disability support services, but definitely with sort of psychosocial services and things like that. When it's all been privatised and left up to businesses to provide these services, they will only provide these services if it's profitable for them, and it's not in particularly in a lot of remote and rural areas, it's not profitable for them. So there's not, the services are lacking. And I mean, one of the big things about the NDIS was supposed to give people choice. There are no choices if you live in a rural town. You're lucky if you've got one provider, let alone a choice of, you know, different services to get your support.
When we're talking about privacy and confidentiality as well, you know, in some of these communities, everyone knows everyone. You know, and some of these people don't want to talk to people from their community because they're going to go tell Joe Blog and this person over there and whatever, or it may involve people who live within the community. Or it may also involve they may be still living at the centre where they were abused. You know, there's all these things. And so outreach is really important, not just outreach to go and talk to services and spread the word about the scheme, outreach to go there and service people that want to be serviced by somebody outside of the region. But that's not funded. That's not even considered.
I think it really highlights the role that the government has and the responsibility they have to fund services, but also to evaluate and monitor how those services are operating to make sure that they are high quality, they are accessible for people as well. And that's certainly a gap that we continue to see across the country.